It was a Sunday afternoon in 2001 when I opened my issue of the Toronto Star and was drawn to the picture of a handsome young man named Father Martin Royackers. The picture was surrounded by flowers, and the headline read, "Reverend Martin Royackers was a man of the people and a tobacco-stained bundle of contradictions." In the wake of his murder in Jamaica, many are calling him a martyr. Leslie Scrivener, a freelance writer, remembers him presiding over the wedding of her sister. Quote, "Radiant in white, a handsome groom, and a young priest in his priestly garments, old desert boots right off the farm, stained with farm matter." His sermon was about the different kinds of love, and Leslie Scrivener wrote, "We were in awe." He had a down-home earthiness, a disregard for convention. Yes, he was a Jesuit, and his mind was razor sharp. The bride and groom were university students at Guelph who had been living together for 8 months before the wedding. Father Royackers persuaded them to live as brother and sister until the big day, and they agreed. My sister, Leslie writes, remembers him at the Boo Bar at the university, hunched over a pile of papers, writing furiously. He wasn't there to drink, but to smoke, and once to hear my sister's confession. People were playing billiards, she recalls, and there was ping, ping, ping of video games, and all the TV screens around us were showing the most gruesome scenes from the movie Silence of the Lambs, and my sister was confessing her sins. Nothing fazed him. It was important to him not to create barriers. As I continued, a remarkable figure began to emerge. Not a plastic holy man, but a formidable presence who left a mark on everyone he met. Once at Regis College, where he was studying theology, someone called security reporting there was a homeless man in the building. It was Martin. Some said he didn't quite fit into the Jesuit community. But in intelligence, the pursuit of social justice, the option for the poor, a life of poverty, he genuinely lived his vows. And the more I learned about him, the more I was drawn to him, like no one else in my life since reading Thomas Merton's The Seven-Story Mountain. I am certain Pope Francis would have loved him. Here then are some more memories that I gathered. Memories of Martin.
Jamaicans, all 2.5 million of them, are proud of their culture, proud of Bob Marley and reggae music, Rastafarianism and revival religions rooted in African spirituality. They are independent and nationalistic. Jamaica has a sizable and educated middle class, but behind and away from the sparkling beaches and posh hotels, there's a rural population struggling to survive. 60 kilometers north of Kingston, Jamaica, lies Onato Bay and the parish of St. Teresa. The pastor, Father Martin Royackers.
Dear Doug, this is a long overdue letter. I was in Canada for a week not long ago for my grandmother's funeral. I didn't contact any Jesuits, not even you, though in your case the reason was distance. Things are going as well in Jamaica as one can expect. I'm now the proud manager of a retreat house. I got 2 schoolrooms built last year. I used to mock Jesuits who like to build, and here I am in the same situation. I've just finished running a water line a mile through the bush, which will provide 5 houses with water and hopefully allow for expanded irrigation. This was a very satisfying activity. It may interest you to know that most Sundays I spend a total of 7 hours behind the altar, 2 2-hour masses and 1 3-hour one, and the oddest thing about it is I enjoy it all. Jim Webb received a death threat in this past week. It was over 60 acres of government land that was reassigned for the use of some of our poor farmers. The police say we should take it seriously. Certainly if I die, I want to be buried here in Jamaica, to be waked in a funeral parlor that allows smoking, and I want you, Doug, to say the Mass. I'm heading home now. With much affection, Martin.
June the 20th, 2001, shortly after 9 o'clock.
Can't believe it. Can't believe it. What it is.
Martin Roy Ackers had come to Onato Bay from Canada 6 years before and had become pastor of 5 parishes and 6 schools. He was 41 years old.
I remember at his funeral, I was very impressed, very touched, very moved when I saw the amount of young Jamaicans, men and women, who came to mourn his passing. I hardly saw a person who was not crying. It was a very moving event. For them, they had lost a priest, a brother, a father, a mother, a friend, a Jamaican. He was not in this thing for things or prestige or honor. He was in there for love of God and love of his brothers and sisters. What touched me very much was when Father Jim Webb said to the people, there's a hearse in front of the church, but we will not be using the hearse. And I want to explain to you that we're not being disrespectful to Martin, but Martin's vehicle was called a poor man's hearse. And he wished to be transported in that.
Martin would have been astonished by this outpouring of affection. He had at one time looked on his assignment to Jamaica as a banishment, a mark of failure and rejection, the humiliating consequence of his struggle with a rebel spirit that haunted him throughout his life as a Jesuit, a spirit which some believe had bedeviled him since childhood. Park Hill, a farming area in central Ontario. Joanne and Albert Roy Ackers came here from Holland in 1952 and eventually settled on this 200-acre farm. They were pig farmers. In 1959, Martin was born, the second of 5 children. 3 months after Martin was murdered, his father died. His mother, Joanne, remembers the early years.
Martin was a serious little boy. He could be very stubborn, and if he had something on his mind that he thought was right, nothing could change his mind.
As long as I can remember, Martin just loved to read, always.
One time we had a dance. Here I was, a grade 12 student, and my younger brother came to a high school dance with a book, and he sat out in the hallway outside the gym, and he sat there and he read his book. I remember being completely embarrassed and pretending that I didn't know him.
Don Van Massenhoven, a referee in the NHL, lived on a farm that bordered on Martin's.
Growing up with Martin, he was always focused and determined, and he always seemed to be looking ahead. And I don't actually remember when he spoke about becoming a priest, but he just seemed to want to do something different. Martin would never let you pick on the other kids. If you know, not that I was someone that did that a lot, but when we played and things happened, he was always kind of looking out for the other children and very caring. And he always seemed to feel that he was going on to something bigger and better.
When Martin told us of his decision to enter the Jesuits, Albert tried to really talk him out of it, and I just wanted him to be happy.
When he was 18 years old, Martin turned down scholarships from 3 Ontario universities and began to pursue his dream of becoming a Jesuit. The Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits, is a Roman Catholic religious order of men founded 450 years ago in Paris by a Spaniard named Ignatius Loyola. They take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and a 4th vow of special obedience to the Pope. The Jesuits dedicate themselves to serving the Church, especially in the areas of education, foreign missions, and social action. One day in June 1978, Martin Royackers came here to the Jesuit novitiate in Guelph, Ontario, seeking to be admitted. Martin was extremely shy with no social skills. Normally, the Jesuits would have encouraged him to go to university and then come back and enter the novitiate. But they made an exception in Martin's case for 2 reasons. They saw something special in him, and they thought he would develop socially more easily in community life than at university. So he was accepted. It may or may not have been the right decision. Roger Jaworski was Martin's superior for his 2 years at the novitiate.
His parents had driven him up, and as we talked, I mispronounced his name, and Martin immediately said, "I didn't mispronounce your name. Would you pronounce mine correctly?" And I said, "Oh, Martin, there are 10 novices, and I've just got a little nervous today." Martin was extremely gifted intellectually. So it was very much an intellectual decision, I think, that he had made, that this was a good thing. Well, as we know, our intellectual decisions and the realities, when we get into them, can be very different.
During the 2 years at the novitiate, farming was one of the various activities in which the candidates were engaged. Martin, with his farm background, was totally at home with this. But the life of the novice centers on the spiritual exercises of their founder, Ignatius Loyola. Rigid rules of conduct and a kind of military discipline are designed to measure your understanding of poverty, your practice of chastity, and especially your spirit of obedience.
I don't think obedience was easy for Martin. And as you know, for Jesuits, that is one of the hallmarks. Because again, if you're going to be available for mission, you're sent on mission. You're always sent by an authority. And this proved true for Martin even after the novitiate. Anybody who was in authority with him was always struggling, shall we say, in terms of being clear about what the society was asking as opposed to what Martin wanted to do.
Martin would be faithful to his vows, but submitting to authority would always be a challenge to the rebel spirit inherent in his character. This problem became apparent in curious ways during his novitiate.
At the time, yeah, there was a kind of adolescent rebellion going on. I think he was trying to establish his identity. What I've come to see now is underneath, I think there was basically a fear that someone was taking over his life. Someone was telling him who he was, what he was to become. And he didn't like that. Martin was psychologically complex.
He became a chain smoker and totally indifferent as to how he looked or how he dressed. To this day, this change in his behavior remains a mystery to his family.
The first time we were in his room in the Jesuits was in Christmas, and it was a pig pen, and that's how the rest of his life was, and I haven't got a clue why.
Why did Martin choose to be so provocative? Was dressing like a slob Martin's idea of penance? Was it simply adolescent rebellion? After all, he was only 19. Or was it something deeper? The residue of conflict with his father's authority that had never been resolved.
One pair of Martin's pants had particularly become worn out to the point that his underwear was showing. I had really had it. So I marched down to the pool room and said, "See," as I was cutting the legs off the pants, "if you'll wear these pants again," and then tossed the pants at him and walked off.
That did it. Throughout his next 16 years as a Jesuit in Canada and his final 6 years in Jamaica, Martin consistently refused to bend to repeated, often severe pressures to dress appropriately and to give up smoking. In other respects, Martin was a model of obedience and dedication. He never wavered in his love of the Jesuits, and he never ceased to challenge them or anyone else he cared about. On May the 28th, 1988, after 10 years of training, Martin was ordained to the priesthood. He was 29. His mother remembers the day well.
The day he was ordained seemed to be a culmination of a lot of things. It was just a happy time. I think we were all very proud of him, and he seemed to be very happy.
Martin was now a priest. But the self-examination, the reflecting, the questioning would never cease.
Every night I sit on the tiny veranda of my house in Anato Bay, cooling out, as they say in Jamaica, enjoying a final cigarette of the day and doing my night prayers. This moment of peace is usually accompanied by loud music from the neighbor's stereo. In your last letter, you asked about any concerns I have for the Jesuits today. I hope I can offer them without sounding pompous or platitudinous. I think the problem for some of them is that its core, which is religious life in the traditional sense and the radical imitation of Christ, is being eroded. Everything Ignatius writes is dismissed as passé medievalism. Maybe I fear it for myself. Perhaps this is in part a reaction to feeling rejected and unwanted in Canada. However, since my retreat, I am feeling more settled here and becoming fonder of my sheep every day. I'll write again soon. Martin.
Long before coming to Jamaica, Martin's ability to analyze and to express his thoughts was enhanced by his experience writing and editing for the Jesuit journal Compass. Bob Chodas was the editor.
Yeah, Martin actually joined the editorial team before I did. He had been critical of the magazine, and instead of just criticizing, he decided to volunteer to work on it. He was interested in all aspects of putting it out and willing to contribute to all aspects of putting it out. I've known other people who rejected North American material values. Many people do in one way or another. But I don't think I've ever known anybody who lived that rejection as deeply and as constantly as Martin did.
While still contributing to Compass, Martin was named chaplain to the Catholic students at Guelph University. The city of Guelph is located some 40 miles west of Toronto. Dan Hurley was a student at Guelph when Martin became chaplain.
In the beginning, he just became a confidant. I could, as kind of a born-again Catholic, I had a lot of questions. We both shared a lot of concerns about the institution of the church and really tried, and for me it was great because he became a great friend in the end because we realized that the spirit of the church was our communion. And so that's what we shared together.
Dale Duquesne has been a member of the Catholic community of Guelph University for the past 30 years.
Before he even completely took off his vestments at the end of Mass, he was rolling another cigarette, and a pile of people would gather around him to catch every word that he was saying. And he always had something profound and funny, great sense of humor, very dry sense of humor, but the students loved him.
During the 8 years following his ordination, when he was writing for Compass and acting as chaplain at the university, Martin lived at the Jesuit farm in Guelph. He worked the land in the evenings and on weekends and assisted with the experimental community founded by his friend, Father Doug McCarthy. The farm served as a halfway house for convicts from Guelph Penitentiary. Also, people who were mentally handicapped were welcome to this community. The farm allowed Martin to work physically at what he loved most, assisted by the people with whom he was most comfortable, the marginalized. Louisa Blair had been searching for a religious community. She came to the farm in Guelph as a volunteer and stayed for 3 years.
Martin didn't fit into any category that you could devise, really. I mean, he, by all appearances, he was a farm boy from southwestern Ontario, and he looked like one. You know, he's always, his manure on his boots and cigarette in his hand, and out there looking at the hay crop. But there was also this extremely intellectual side of him, and as I say, this really tender side of him that came out with the most broken people, that you would never really guess. If you were in one context, you wouldn't guess the person in the other context, you know. And he never said anything to please anybody. He just said what he thought, you know, and it really didn't please people at all.
Bill Clark, a fellow Jesuit with Martin at the farm.
I was the director with Martin, and when I went away on sabbatical, I had put Martin in charge as the acting director. And I mean, he did a great job because he welcomed people in the community that I would never have welcomed.
Now, I remember once sitting around the supper table at the Red House, and there was a woman living there who would go out and regularly, in the middle of the meal, would go out and lie in the middle of the road on Highway 6. I mean, it's a very busy, dangerous road. And Martin would just quietly get up and go out to the road and talk to her with just infinite gentleness and bring her back into the house. For people who were really broken, I mean, he was just as tender as you could possibly be.
His greatest strength was just his passion for life. He was a man of tremendous faith. I think he had a real passion for God. And for him, the welcoming of really little broken people and really was a part of that passion for God somehow.
He could create a sort of feeling of tension around him when he was working, because he pushed himself really hard and he pushed the people who were working with him equally hard. And one time I remember just walking off the site, and eventually he came back up and he talked to me about it, and he asked me, and I said, you just create this atmosphere of tension and around you when you're in that kind of a work mode, and it's just unbearable, you know. And he said, you know what, that is exactly what it felt like working with my father.
He was under this authoritarian rule. His dad was just over him all the time, and it just, you know, from the stories he told me, it didn't seem to, anything he did wasn't right. So, and he was also the protector for the rest of the family. Protected his mother, protected his brothers, sisters, he being the oldest boy. And when he was 18, he moved to the Jesuits, thinking that he was going to get away from all that. And what happened to him when he moved into the Jesuits, he found his father all over again.
He was not diplomatic, and he wasn't political either. And I would say those things, in the long run, might have done him in.
Life at the farm became more and more difficult for Martin. Tensions mounted between staff members. There was the question of organic farming versus traditional, with Martin in favor of traditional. Should the farm be economically viable and pay for itself, or be primarily a place for rehabilitation? Martin believed that if it didn't pay for itself, the Jesuit authorities would be forced to close it. He proved to be right. Finally, and most importantly, who really was in control of this community? The lay council or the Jesuits? Martin was in the thick of all these conflicts. The disagreements and personality clashes led to his downfall and would culminate in a crushing blow to the spirit of Martin Royackers. Father John English was superior of the Jesuit house at Guelph.
I recommended that Martin be removed from the farm. He was a disruptive personality in that whole setting. He didn't seem to fit in, so that's why I asked Eric to remove him from the farm.
When I heard that Martin had been asked to leave the community, my first thought was, those guys have not seen what I've seen. They should have followed him round and watched how he was with people, you know. And they listened to the people who had a voice. But the people who didn't have a voice are the ones who really could have told them what Martin was about.
In the summer of 1993, Father Eric McLean, the provincial of the Jesuits, removed Martin. When he celebrated his final Mass there, those in attendance said he shook all through it. Martin felt his life had been wasted.
His radical belief that what we were doing here was right. It was so integral to his way of being a Jesuit. It's so integral to his faith in God, I would say, you know. The farming, the welcoming of people, the living from the land, I just think it was integral in some ways to who he was as a Jesuit, as a Christian, and as a man.
What do you do with Martin? That became the question. Jim Webb suggested that Martin go to Jamaica as a solution to Martin's personality and the kind of person he was.
But how could he be sure that Martin would go to Jamaica?
I also, you know, felt, well, he's a Jesuit, you know, he's supposed to be obedient. I think a lot of other people felt that way, too.
Tomorrow, the second and final part of Memories of Martin. To restore peace, Father John English suggested the provincial remove Martin from the tensions of the Jesuit farm in Guelph and assign him to a mission in Jamaica. It was an inspired move. Jamaica liberated Martin Royackers. In his years there, he experienced a kind of resurrection, and it was there also that he met his death.